Guys, do not trust this book. Before Sun and Moon is a lie. Honestly, we should have seen this coming. It's like we've learned nothing in the last 4 years. And after Scar, dude, we know only fictional stories can't be altered by Irminsul. And yes, Sun and Moon does have some merit with parables and riddles, but historical records? Why do we even think those are accurate? In fact, back before the release of Fontaine, I had a written theory that Enkanomiya was ruled by dragons before it sank, but I didn't have any evidence to prove my suspicion. Like an idiot, I put the whole idea to rest just because these statues have human ears. Now I'm regretting not being bold enough to release this theory into the wild. Needless to say, I am now revisiting my thoughts after Natlan. But before we get down to it, a few things. This is a theory using info up to 5.0. I will first be discrediting history found in Before Sun and Moon, then we'll review identities of the dragon's sovereigns, take another look at the Black Serpent Knights, and touch on the heavenly envoys. Just know I am bound to forget things and make mistakes. Also, we're going to be cross-contaminating info from these quests. If for any reason you haven't done these, watch your step, because there's going to be a slippery slope with spoilers ahead. With that said, brace yourself. This is going to be a wild ride. As always, before we can build our theory, we must first lay a foundation. All history in Teyvat is seen and recorded by one entity, a blue-pink tree called Irminsul. Now this is where the past, present, and possibly the future is recorded. And like any information databank, anyone with access to this tree's info can potentially tamper with the facts recorded within. This results in a worldwide memory update of the new reality. Even what's written is subject to change. Akaba's report updated when Scaramouche tried to delete himself. This is the vulnerability that history has. In fact, we're already pretty sure that history was rewritten, likely when the Second Throne took over. But there's more to it than that. So why do we, the player, put so much validity to the historical record found in this book, Before Sun and Moon? Because Kanryo was after it? Or because Orobashi was sentenced to death after reading it? Well, I don't think those two factors put that much weight to the matter. First off, just because you're searching for a book you think has proof, doesn't mean that it does. Perhaps at one point it had the information you need, but if authorities have already redacted that info, you're simply too late. And really, you want as much evidence stacked in your favor to make a case. Evidence from multiple sources. One book does not stack make. And regarding Orobashi, I'm doubting the whole sentence to death thing. You see, I have a good reason to think Orobashi was exposed to abyssal contamination. Based on similar entities, we can gain better insight. According to those exposed to corrosions, symptoms can include, but is not limited to, hallucinations, purple-black smoke coming off of your person, and violent changes in behavior. Some examples of this are Apep, Dainsleif, Shao, Cheska, likely Shenhe as well. But the only concrete evidence available to us about Orobashi is a giant Skeletor chopped to pieces over on Yashiori Island. So let's compare those other powerful beings. When Egeria perished, she turned into the Amrita that fights back the abyss. Also a Jello tree. For those who forgot, the Amrita is a pool of the purest water. No abyssal contamination there. Then we have Havria, the god of salt, which exploded, but again, there was no abyssal contamination present in her city thereafter. On the other hand, Rugadavada had to Control-Alt-Delete herself because she couldn't clean the contamination. Also, one of the dragons in Liyue, the Chi, left contamination that remains to this day. Interestingly, they may have been one of Elianess's and Durin's siblings. Now, unlike Durin, for instance, the Chi didn't have a sky nail to purify the land after their death. And in Baiju's story quest, we see the muck remains to this day. It's actually pretty bad in there. And therein lies my point about Orobashi. From the skeleton, you can mine an ore called crystal marrow. When processed for forging, the byproduct causes a dense black smoke that affects Higi village negatively. The villagers get sick and suffer from delusional thoughts and violent behavior. And speaking of violent behavior, Orobashi attacked Narukami Island. Now, whether this was deliberately planned, or if it was an irrational action, it doesn't really matter. Since 1, abyssal corruption is terminal, and 2, if you know you're gonna die, you'll usually plan for when that happens. See, I don't think Orobashi's death was a heavenly judgment at all. It was a result of corruption. And the part about the people being condemned too is simple. If Orobashi hadn't chosen to kamikaze, the corrosion would become so bad that it would spread to his people. That, or he would turn on them, destroying them himself. That kinda happened to Deshret. But if this death sentence is a lie, that brings into question the Conrian curse. Turning into monsters, going mad, and having your internal clock suspended, like Jacob, are all things we've seen the Abyss do. Is there even anyone cursing people? Or is it just the voracious intent of the Abyss? Because we can't trust any of our history. So, if what we read can't be trusted, what really happened? The book Before Sun and Moon should contain our oldest record of history, but whether it's been tampered with remains to be seen. Heads up, this next section is all hypothetical. Feel free to skip ahead to the proof if you're not interested. Previously, I had theorized an alternative scenario regarding Enkanomiya's past, and it starts with the primordial one. During the reign of the dragons, the ley lines were smooth and well ordered. Nibelung was the original primordial one. Then there came invaders from beyond the world. That started a war. The dragon sovereigns were losing, causing the Dragon King to turn to abyssal power and perish. After the king's death and defeat, the invaders then had access to what he protected, the king's throne and Irminsul. This throne was the position of Creator itself and the title Primordial One. And with access to Irminsul, they then had the means to rewrite history, effectively hijacking all the subjects of Teyvat. Now, with every human convinced that dragons are now the enemy, they turn on them. Labeled as horrifying tyrants, we see what disaster was wrought on the dragon cities. In Enkanomiya, we have records of just that. The death of the Hydro Sovereign has to be what caused Enka to sink. Stuck in a cavern together, they tore each other apart. Now, when I made this theory, everything I just said was based solely off of one statement. Understanding that Irminsul can rewrite everything, I looked back at Sumi from the Three Realms Gateway offering event. Having been fostered by Vishaps, her viewpoint should be one shared by them. She states that dealing with humans can only lead to betrayal. She could have said something like, "You can never trust a human." Now, I'm possibly overthinking this, but for there to be betrayal, doesn't that imply that there was once trust? Humans turning on all dragon kind sure fits the bill of a betrayal. At least one bad enough to warrant such a deep-rooted hate. But now that we're in Natlan, we now have confirmation that these ancient cities are dragon civilizations. But that's enough fanfiction for now. All over the world, we can find these dragon cities. Down in the chasm, Dainsleif confirms that the architecture style is similar to Conria, yet even older. This is no doubt the unified civilization that once existed. Now in this context, let's scoop up and re-examine our scattered evidence. Or at least most of it. We're not going to cover all the elements because, say, there's no info at all, or Like Pyro, we will get more lore very, very soon. Mnt Sovereign. Not to start off on the wrong foot, but we know nothing about their identity. However, I question whether Decarabian might have been the Sovereign. My only reasoning here is the use of light actuators in his city, and the fact it later becomes the perfect nest for Dvalin. Were that the case, it's somewhat poetic that the previous Sovereign's city is inherited by the successor years later. HOYO-Sovereign. In the chasm, we have the upside-down dragon city. This should be the Geodragon's domain. Now, Azhdaha has never been confirmed as a sovereign, and Zhongli never gave the Geo authority back. However, I previously spent a lot of time down here looking for dragon death sites, and this place was always top of my list. Though there's now a lot of abyssal corrosion in the environment, it didn't used to be like that. Or at least not as bad. But this location directly under the tower is where I think the previous Geo-Sovereign died. It calls to mind the point of impact from Havria's self-destruction. And I would believe the death of the Geo-Sovereign could cause such turmoil as to make the ground heave and flip the whole city upside down. Now, there's a few things of note here. We know Zhongli is familiar with the chasm. I wager this is where he found Azhdaha deep underground. Suppose he found him in the remains of the previous Geo-Sovereign. Perhaps the scattered geo-energy had once again coagulated into the core of a dragon, which Zhongli then placed inside a form he carved himself. Or maybe the Sovereign lost most of his elemental energy, and thus his memories, shrinking back into a core. We've seen other powerful beings display similar symptoms. Regardless, Azhdaha may or may not be the previous Sovereign, but currently he's incomplete, much like Neuvillette before Fossilors died. I also want to point out that the chasm is one of the few places we find Black Serpent Knights. Remember this? I'll come back to it. And fun fact, Khedive gives us a side quest in which we take 5 pictures of dragon fossils. But no human ones. In hindsight, it makes this dragon civilization thing kinda obvious. Electro Sovereign. Their identity has been in contention since the release of Inazuma. However, I think we can finally pinpoint who it was. No, it wasn't Orobashi, though he was likely a descendant of ancient dragons. But I'm convinced he wasn't the Sovereign. It was Kapatcir, the Thunderbird. There is an Inazuma-specific variation of old ruins that uses dragon-like designs. I mean, sort of dragon-like, but when compared to the architecture in Natlan, maybe you can see it. I have always thought that these here, were dragons, but never had more than my imagination to base it off of. And whereas these structures are found all over Inazuma, some of the biggest structures are found, 1, under where Kapatcir fell, on Seirai Island, and 2 on Tsurumi Island with the Thunderbird Perch. Now, one thing about modern-day Inazuma that's worth noting is their use of bird motifs. They actually use fox and fish as well. The fox is clear to me, and I might be able to make a connection to the fish with the close proximity to Enkanomiya. But a bird, too? Perhaps if there were humans previously under the Electro Dragon, or bird, it explains this. The Shogun does not use birds in her designs. In fact, her sister, Makoto, turns into a tree that is shaped like a fox. Even though Miko says it's because of years of pruning the tree to suit her aesthetics, I think the Shogun and her sister were twin Sky Kitsune. After all, the Sky Kitsune are said to have turned themselves to statues after the loss of their master, meaning that A wasn't the master. In fact, I doubt Makoto was either. And the Sky Kitsune at the harbor with 5 drums matches up with the 5 drums we see on the Statue of 7 in Inazuma. And if you consider these two faces with a bird-shaped crown, perhaps we can deduce the heads wearing the crests are fox warriors. I know the one kind of has Oni vibes, but yokai are kind of a minority in Inazuma. It's not like we see Nekomata or Tengu designs anywhere. So, yep, that's my story. The kitsune are the servants wearing the likeness of their master, the Thunderbird. And if you remember from the Tsurumi World Quest, Kapatcir had a name once, but no longer remembered it. When their Electro authority was seized, it most definitely would cause memory loss, much like what happens when a vision is seized by force. Because we see this process in reverse. Neuvillette gains memories upon receiving the Hydro authority. And when you consider Kapatcir's story with Rue, it's very similar to Venti and Dvalin. Speaking of Tsurumi, Thunderbird's perch was likely the original ley line tree of the Inazuma region. I'm inclined to believe she was guarding the ley line tree. Being the tree's guardian was probably how she knew how to curse the island into a time loop. Ling Yuan in Chenyu Vale also shows this knowledge. It's no wonder why the shogun had to slay Kapatcir, angry as she was. And when she fell, all of Seirai Island was shrouded in a dense electro field. Her electro energy likely exploded just like we see in the chasm. Dendro Sovereign. Everyone knows Apep was the sovereign. She tells us as much herself. Though she doesn't show signs of memory loss from losing the authority, Apep's likely too proud to admit it, even were it true. But what I have to say about this sovereign has more to do with Nahida. During the Battleland Summer event, I posted a theory on Reddit using this image in which I compare Nahida's eyes to a gecko's. I only did this because the Warden of the Heart's Oasis borrows inspiration from geckos. It's literally just gecko feet with a tail. Fast forward to Natlan, and we have Yoshi-like geckos with the same eye pattern as Nahida. You don't say! Okay, I'll stop. One more thing. As a Seelie, I have to wonder if the goddess of flowers was a child and envoy of Apep. She helps create the Jinn, creatures of wisdom, and the Pari, which both take flower shape. The Lao Par's fragments are golden flower petals, and her mural likeness is pink-colored, kind of like Sarouche. Not to be obvious, but flowers are dendro-elemented, not hydro. Hydro Sovereign. We will not review Neuvillette's character stories. He's the Hydro Sovereign, the end. However, you should know that his theme song is very similar to the soundtrack within Enkanomiya. Much like how the great dream song the Aranara teach us is similar to the dream aria that plays in the opening title screen. If you want to know what I mean, you can watch this video I made here. With Nuvi's theme, I happened upon the realization one day and instantly felt dumb. Of course, the new Hydro Sovereign's music has callbacks to the old Sovereign's city. I'll likely make another video of me singing to prove this point. Now, the only other thing of note here is about Kokomi, since she's a descendant from the people of Enkanomiya. I don't know why her eyes are similar to a Koholosaur from Natlan, but Neuvillette's is closer to the baptismal Vishap under Inazuma. Perhaps Hoyo will have pity on me and flesh out more details one day. Pyro Sovereign. As I said, we are still getting lore about our Pyro Dragon, so I'm not going to waste my time and yours with a detailed explanation. As others cover it, I will link a description below. But we do know the previous Pyro Sovereign was Suikoru. We don't yet have a candidate for the new one. Now, I'll admit, I'm having a hard time believing that dragons were tyrannical rulers. But there have been disastrous dragons before, and I suspect most of those were creations of Rhindaughter. We have no idea just how many she created. but I see no reason why one of these couldn't become a sovereign. I don't know, I'm gonna have to wait a long time for more information. But looking back at the narration of Simyalanka, I feel like the whole point was to tell us to take an objective look at dragons. Don't believe what stories tell you. The truth is often different than what we assume. And even the summer event with Dodo King was very similar. Dodo King was portrayed to be an enemy, even calling itself such. But in the end, Dodo King was just a loving mother, Alice. This better not be a spoiler for the end of Genshin Impact. The ones watching over you all along were the dragons, your creator. One other suspicion I will share about Natlan is about the Wayab and the Night Kingdom. Crystal beetles found in Natlan contain phlogiston, but turn into an iron chunk when harvested. Now, we do know dragons can petrify upon death, and we also know there's such a phenomenon as elemental beings containing a crystal heart that can survive death. So if I'm right that dragons were guardians of the leyline trees, and thus guardians to the ley lines, well, Natlan's ley lines are the Night Kingdom, and the Wayabs, combined with the sacred flames, serve the purifying function that ley lines do. Much like the crystal beetle, the fire and the container for the fire are just separated. By now you're probably on the same page. Because if sacred fire can be lava, it can certainly turn into obsidian. The Wayabs are likely giant crystal hearts from 6 giant dragons of Natlan. They catch the minds of their fallen children lest they become lost, and keep them safe from the corroding abyss, purifying filth much like the sacred Sakura. And this memory transfer thing we see with Mualani is very reminiscent of Neuvillette getting a memory download when he received the authority. But it seems like this giant Wayab totem is special. It's awfully weird that the stone is teleporting and projecting its consciousness, much like the sinner. He's not a dragon, right? Well, maybe he stole the abilities of a dragon. And under the Great Shadow Pin, we have more Black Serpent Knight lore. It's glorious. But before we get to that, I will just say we have no mention of hide or hair about the HOYO Sovereign. I could point fingers blindly, but that's kind of a useless endeavor. So I will wait on that as well. But based on the Silver Laurels artifact set, I think at least 4 Dragon Sovereigns died. Hydro, Cryo, Pyro, and Electro, with the possibility of Geo being among those. And hey, there's 5 trees around the Abyssal Rift in the Kavarna. Actually, I'm just spouting nonsense now. Ignore me! Now for the part that's really spicy. The world quest, Shadows of the Mountains, gives us lore about 2 Conrian soldiers. The fact that these 2 are here fighting back the Abyss is so exciting to me. You see, while putting together this theory, I realized something. Conrian royal knights were named Serpent Knights because they were knights of the serpents. In other words, they were dragon guards. Think about all the places we find them. The Chasm in Kanomiya, the statues under the Kavarna, and in Natlan sealed by a golden inscription. Or basically a seal by a dragon. 'Cause there's no way you can convince me this design isn't a dragon head. Even comparing the helmet of the captains to this inscription shows similar design elements. That's also the case with Abyss Super Mages, but I don't care about them right now. The Twilight Sword, Dainsleif, is the captain of the Royal Guard. Now, normally, a Royal Guard is made up of nobles, ones of a special bloodline, or those who perform prestigious feats. The captains, or the leaders, are often chosen from royalty, like cousins and families with shared bloodlines. But what I think this new info from Natlan tells us is that Dane has dragon blood in his veins. Whether that's from being awarded this from a dragon, or being a descendant of dragons, I suspect that Khaenri'ah was ruled by a dragon. The dragon, Nibelung, and that Ermin was another name for the same person. And this giant door surrounded by black serpent statues is found under Sumeru, supposedly the center of the world where Irminsul is suspected to be. Remember what I said about Kapatcir possibly being the guardian of the leyline tree in Inazuma? Yeah, well, I believe that was all the Sovereign's job, to guard the ley lines. Thus, Nibelung should have guarded the most important tree, Irminsul itself, and Khaenri'ah, through the Black Serpent Knights, guarded the dragons. Because remember, Khaenri'ah was very dependent on the ley lines and the roots of Irminsul. Now, when Celestia usurped the ley lines, it would have been wise to also remove any other threats to their prize, the tree. And I think this is why Khaenri'ah was wiped out from the map. Celestia had to delete any information that Irminsul belonged to dragons. They needed to become the world's creator. But Khaenri'ah's entire culture was centered around dragons, even having dragonkin in their midst. But Celestia didn't simply kill the nation. Oh no. They ripped out the very core belief from their minds, causing them and everyone to forget who they were. Dain himself can barely remember anything of significance. And I think this kind of explains his unique stance when it comes to gods. Paimon states that she can't tell whether Dain respects or hates them. That's because it's both. He respects his liege, whom he can no longer remember, but hates the ones who overthrew and replaced them. And I also think this factor sheds light on Dain's relationship with the Abyss Twin. The twin calls Dain a traitor, but doesn't bother to clarify. Well, that's because the information infringes on deleted knowledge. We see Traveler do the same thing in omitting info about Rukkhadevata. So now, I'm mostly convinced that Dainsleif is a traitor either because he chose to protect the people instead of Ermin and Ermin's soul, or because he used to remember his noble cause, but has since abandoned it in pursuit of the Abyss Order. On a slightly less heavy topic, I think this scenario also explains why divine envoys, and thus devices like the radio tower in Chenyu Vale, suddenly stopped working. History recorded in Dragonspine, Surumi Island, and Chenyu Vale all have murals depicting the people once communicating with divinity, but at some point being cut off. If I'm on to something about any of this, that cutoff would be when Celestia took over. To add to this idea, when you compare this Jade Tower to the nodes in Irminsul and to the golden inscriptions in Natlan, they all share this lopsided design element. The dragon envoys were all punished, stripped of their minds, just as the Flowers of Paradise Lost set claims. If the envoys were Celestia's servants, there really wouldn't be a need for punishment. But purging the knowledge of dragons required such extreme measures. The envoys became useless husks Celestia couldn't use. And wasn't all this kind of the point of Simulanka? The whole plot was a narrative of how a dragon wanted to live in harmony with people, but was perceived as evil for basically no reason at all. In fact, I'm beginning to think that the Hexen Circle's entire goal is to save dragons. Alice and Klee are dragonkin. Klee even does the same energy transfer in Bottleland with Kokomi that Neuvillette and Passive does with the Traveler. Even N is not human, likely also a dragon or dragonkin. Then who the flip knows what Rhine-Daughter's goal is? Probably to resurrect dragons, but that said, I wonder if the club had beef with Venti in the past cause he, slayed Durin? But he's like, no man, make peace, not war. See, me and Devalin are best buds. And they let it slide. Well, my friends, my audience, my captives. I know this was a long video, but this was a long-time suspicion of mine. Dragons. Everything comes back to dragons. I just had to wait 5 years for the proof. I am so jazzed about it. But before I go, I'll share a music theory. You know how there's these voice soundtracks in rare and important places? Like the Eternal Oasis, Storm Terror's Lair, Enkanomiya, and the Narcissenkreuz Ordo HQ. Come Natlan, and there's voices all over the soundtrack. Well, rather than being gods singing, what if the voices represent the presence of dragons fallen? Just think about that, cause, well, I'm done here. I still got more lore to dig up and process, so... This is Sanod Kraken. Watch out for pools of lava out there in Natlan. They're dangerous.